If China attacks Vietnam again in the near future, who will help VN? In recent years, China has always expanded in the East Sea. They want 90% of the East Sea area to be theirs, encroaching on the territorial waters of countries in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. They are disregarding the law. International law considers decisions of international law as a waste of paper, and makes the situation in the East Sea more tense than ever, especially after Vietnam upgraded relations with the US. Will China attack Vietnam in the near future? If so, what scale will it occur, whether at sea or on land? And if there will be a conflict between China and Vietnam? Let's learn and analyze sensitive topics. As we know, China has continuously invaded Vietnam since 111 BC. Vietnam has had a long and honorable history of resisting Chinese invasions, starting with the invasion and occupation in 39 AD, and most recently, Vietnam overthrew the Chinese warlords. In history was Le Loi who led the uprising against the Ming dynasty in 1428 after 13 invasions of Vietnam. China attacked Vietnam again in 1979 in the context of this time. The Cambodian Red Khmer Rouge had invaded Vietnam, killed 1 of 4 of the Cambodian population, and is also oppressing the Vietnamese people in Cambodia. Vietnam had to send volunteer troops to Cambodia to stop the killing and help the young Cambodian government, China's servant with evil intentions to restrain Vietnam's development. When Vietnam drew closer to the Soviet Union, China invaded Vietnam and said that to give Vietnam a lesson. China's leader at that time, Deng Xiaoping, also took advantage of the war to consolidate control over the Chinese army. China's attack was destroyed and retreated. After a few weeks, China's defeat was largely caused by reserve troops after 1979, with major battles of 1980, 1981, 1984, and 1987, when Deng Xiaoping deployed units to the front to accumulate their combat experience. This is a question that I would like to ask. The question is whether China can attack Vietnam again or not. First of all, it stems from the intentions of the previous generation of Chinese authorities, until the next generation is to expand the country's hegemony. But Vietnam is never a vassal country of China, but a country that always hinders that, especially in the East Sea. They really want to have the first and second island chain, then the Pearl chain. If they want, China must conquer Vietnam. Therefore, at any time, anywhere, Vietnam is seen as vulnerable. The difficulty is that ambition has resurfaced, most recently when they invaded Paracel Island in 1974, causing Vietnam's invasion war in 1979, caused conflict in Spratly in 1988, further proving that over the past 3 decades, China has had continuously high economic growth up to now. Their GDP is nearly equal to the US, and what is being said is that the price to pay for this hot growth is too expensive. Its consequences are the rapid economic development of a country, with a semi-capitalist economy that is far from the goal of. It doesn't matter whether it's a white cat or a black cat, as long as the mouse can be caught. After 3 decades, China has become a greedy country, almost like an empire. A young empire with Chinese characteristics, the essence of imperialism. However, with small neighboring countries, especially Vietnam, the risk of being invaded by the Chinese empire is possible. Let's see to know a little. What is their gut feeling today? Vietnam is the most important threat to China's territorial security, with the desire to invade the East Sea seen from another perspective, showing that Vietnam is also a central strategic focal point of the entire Southeast Asia region. So if China want to control Southeast Asia, they need to conquer Vietnam. Conquering Vietnam is the first step, and the most important step for China to expand to the south. The reason that makes China more likely to attack Vietnam in the next war is that China expands the East Sea and forces Vietnam to remove 17 bases in the East Sea, whether China will invade the Spratly Archipelago first. It must be affirmed that if a certain country controls the East Sea, it will seriously affect the political and economic security interests of the entire region. Any country that controls the Spratly Islands will control the East. Therefore, whether China wants to have a 9-dash line or anything else, it must have a remote archipelago. If the situation of capturing this archipelago occurs, there are 2 options. 1. The first is to secretly and quickly use frogmen to overthrow them. The second step to occupy the island is to use the firepower of the Navy, the Air Force, and missiles to clear the beach, and destroy the defense forces on the island. Then land troops on the island to occupy the island, similar to the exercises that China often does. It is very difficult to implement because with this option, China will only send troops to destroy Hu's vitality completely, because Vietnam's island leader is not simply always equipped with defensive equipment. Carefully. The Vietnamese army, they have practiced this plan very carefully. They fire day and night, hundreds of shots, hundreds of hits, and it can be confirmed that our Navy has carefully prepared arrangements to prevent this type of intrusion. China's second plan is optimal because China has the advantage of having many weapons and strong troops landing in the east. However, it is not surprising that the force will be completely exposed, because the field is too far from their gathering area to implement this plan. China will use firepower to clear the landing site and the defense forces on the island, but the effectiveness is unknown. Vietnam's Spratly defense forces are not foolish to expose their backs to the missiles and artillery of their ships. China said they knew how to avoid it, such as going down to the underground bunker and then welcoming the landing troops of the Chinese army. Only then could we talk about direct confrontation between the entire force that invaded the Chinese island and the island soldiers. In fact, the confrontation with the island defense force, mainly from the mainland of Vietnam, is significant, as mentioned above. China is 3 times farther from the island. Then the combat zone is from the mainland of Vietnam. This is China's fatal disadvantage. The Vietnamese naval staff will know where the Chinese Navy comes from, how it operates, how many ships of what type, and how long it takes to arrive at the Air Force assembly location. How long does it take to return from combat due to running out of fuel, etc.? Surely with Vietnam's current weapons and equipment, such as the fighter jet's Su-30 system, small high-speed missile torpedo boats, etc. After all, a war and military conflict, if it occurs at sea between China and Vietnam, and China cannot occupy the Truong Sa archipelago, will not solve any military problems. On the contrary, the losses will be very high, major in politics and diplomacy. So to achieve its goals, China is ready to open a large, all-out war of aggression both at sea and on land. Is there any reason, like Germany attacking the Soviet Union? There is no reason. Why, even though the two countries have signed a non-aggression treaty with each other, Vietnam must be very vigilant and carefully prepared to welcome them. And on land, there will definitely be conflict. If Vietnam's preparation is not good, tilting the army back to the mainland, China's occupation of the Spratly Islands will be as easy as occupying Paracel Island in 974. China does not want to occupy mainland territory because it does not want to be like previous dynasties. They just wanted to control Spratly and the East Sea. One of the most prominent issues is free and unrestricted access to international waters, and the shipping routes through which China considers the East Sea is a convenient gateway to expand to the south, with the intention of turning their country, which is a mainland, into a country with islands and seas moving down to the East Sea. Islands such as Paracel and Spratly are secretly under the sovereignty of many Southeast Asian countries and even plotted on security, defense, foreign affairs, and politics, especially in the current period, when the U.S. is pivoting to the Asia-Pacific region. In the face of the rise of China, the U.S. is increasing its naval presence in this region overall. President Biden has signaled his intention to maintain a strong U.S. presence in the Indo-Pacific. The European Union has published its Indo-Pacific strategy, which emphasizes the need for free and open access to the seas. International trade routes and all are signs of a war scenario in the region. However, China's tactics are so clever that they only gradually confirm their presence and influence in the region, following the cabbage leaf technique around remote locations. While rejecting legal solutions, they only use a gradual approach to avoid large-scale conflicts, which can be called a procrastination strategy in the future. China will continue to use this tactic to apply the oil spill tactic to expand its reach in the east. And if it encounters obstacles in Vietnam's Spratly archipelago, China's intentions will not come true. So if China wants to take over the East Sea, it must take over Vietnam's Spratly Island. If there really is a war taking place in the near future, the next question is which countries will help Vietnam first. Currently, Vietnam is following the 4-No defense policy, in which Section C does not have a military alliance. So Vietnam currently does not have an ally that can stand side by side to help send troops to help like NATO. We go back to the most recent invasion in 1979. On October 17, 1979, right after China sent troops across the border to invade Vietnam, the Vietnamese government issued a statement affirming its decision, dedicated to protecting the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity, ready to deal back the invaders with worthy blows and at the same time, calling on the governments and people of advanced countries to unite, to support and protect Vietnam, to demand the warlords. Beijing must immediately end the war of aggression against Vietnam and withdraw all troops from Vietnam, declaring clearly that the Vietnamese people and government call on the United Nations and democratic organizations for peace and justice strongly condemned the war of aggression by the Beijing rulers. And at this time, on October 18, 1979, the Soviet government condemned the invasion of Vietnam by the Chinese authorities, and the Soviet Union made a clear statement. Those acts of aggression, contrary to the principles of the United Nations, brutally trampled on international law, further exposed to the whole world the essence of Beijing's hegemony policy in Southeast Asia. The Soviet government affirmed that determined that the Soviet Union resolutely demanded an end to the invasion and immediate withdrawal of Chinese troops from the territory of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. In the territory of Vietnam, the Soviet Air Force also sent its units to work in Vietnam for air reconnaissance against invaders on the territory of Vietnam. The Soviet Union brought more than 400 tanks and armored vehicles to Vietnam. Military vehicles, 400 artillery pieces, more than 400 synchronized mobile anti-aircraft guns, and thousands of accompanying missiles, 800 infantry anti-tank guns, 20 fighter aircraft. This is very important help in the very difficult conditions of Vietnam. But if during this period a war between Vietnam and South and China, which countries can aid and help Vietnam? First of all, Russia. Vietnam and Russia have had a tradition of good relations. Russia continued to be the forerunner of the Soviet Union, helped a lot in Vietnam's war. But currently, Russia and Ukraine are in an armed conflict. Therefore, it is very difficult for Russia to provide weapons aid to Vietnam, because this supply is difficult to guarantee in the future. Because Russia has used a huge number of weapons on the battlefield in Ukraine. The relationship between Russia and China is now closer than ever. The isolation policy of the US and the West pushes Russia east to move closer to China. Meanwhile, China also needs Russia to realize the Chinese dream. Because all around China are America's allies blocking China's footsteps. Both in the past and in the present, Russia and China are under pressure. The two sides are sharing common interests in a pragmatic relationship. So if a war between Vietnam and China occurs, Russia may have a policy of not intervening. If you support Vietnam, you will offend China, causing a difficult situation in Russia's eastward strategy, because Russia is being pressured by Western sanctions. If you support China, you will lose a partner, and the loss of a trustworthy friend, Vietnam. Currently, Vietnam is still an important partner with Russia, importing a lot of weapons supplies from Russia. One of the countries that once helped Vietnam-Japan enthusiastically, Laos, a country next to Vietnam, it is also a brother leaning against the cliff, drinking from the same source of Vietnamese, and Lao ginseng and fighting against enemies. The common defenders are the French colonialists and the American imperialists, and have stuck together in the two wars against the French and the Americans, because of all the strong political and military geographical relationships. Currently, Vietnam is the only way forward to the Sea of Laos. In the context of rapid globalization today, the disadvantages of its landlocked location are increasing day by day, with no road to the sea leading to maritime trade being restricted, high transportation costs, and forced having to depend on neighboring countries with the sea. Once said, if you have a sea, you serve the world. If you are landlocked, you serve your neighbors. Vietnam wants to help Laos from being a landlocked country. Having a sea allows Laos to access Southeast Sea. Laos can export and import goods from other countries through any of Vietnamese rivers, which leads to the Southeast Sea. Vietnam's sensors that facilitate the path of goods at the lowest cost. Vietnam also promotes Laos to invest together, take advantage of international capital to open many routes, connecting the two economies with electricity, and transportation telecommunications networks with a focus on road connection. The Ministry of Railways aims to bring Laos's goods through Vietnamese seaports to international destinations. But Laos is currently facing a difficult situation with a high risk of loan default. According to the Investment Strategy for Infrastructure Development, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's path into debt is growing rapidly. By June 2023, the debt figure with China alone has reached $12 billion. Vietnam had to write off debt to Laos in 2019 and provide non-refundable aid of 3,600 billion Vietnam piastres and $502 million to help Laos overcome difficulties. And especially now, Laos depends on China too much. If the war between Vietnam and China breaks out, Laos will definitely not be able to help Vietnam, when Laos itself is also facing difficulties. And for Cambodia, it certainly will not help Vietnam, because Cambodia is currently China's junior, and promised not to support Vietnam like Vietnam helped Cambodia before. Before it was Hun himself, the general of the latter, crossed the border to Vietnam to ask for help from Cambodia. Vietnam helped Cambodia destroy Pol Pot, saved Cambodia from genocide, helped Cambodia build a government, but currently Cambodia depends heavily on China. Prime Minister Hun Sen once said that we don't rely on China. Who do we rely on? China has poured a lot of money into Cambodia. That's why Cambodia allowed China to build a military port to station troops in Cambodia. Although this information denied by Cambodia, but satellite images show that China is increasingly expanding this military port with Chinese ships anchored here. Cambodia's Zim military port can influence an important part of the Pearl chain for China. China expands its influence and military presence in the world. So if a war breaks out between Vietnam and China, it is likely that Cambodia will help China set up a base for warships and aircraft carriers coming from the military port side. This will be a huge disadvantage for Vietnam and for India. It is very likely that India will support warships and armed equipment to help Vietnam because India is now also a country exporting weapons, and especially there are many hostile aspects with China. China and India are competing for influence in the Indian Ocean region and the East Sea region. Besides, between India and China, there is only enemy on the border. The dispute has lasted for more than 50 years until today. The disputed area is located around the northern area of the McMahon Line, where both India and China claimed their sovereignty many centuries ago as a buffer zone bordering the water border connecting northern India with the two autonomous regions of Xinjiang and Tibet of China, and where conflicts have occurred many times between the two countries. So there is a high possibility that India will support Vietnam in defense. If Vietnam fights against China, this hypothesis proves to be true, because India recently donated the warships to Vietnam to support like-minded partners in improving their national capacity and potential. This also serves as a deterrent to remind China of India's presence in the East Sea. As for Japan, Japan will certainly support Vietnam, because Japan and China are also disputing Senkaku Island, or called Diaoyu. The history of Japan's invasion of China, still a painful and tragic memory for the Chinese people, including those who were not born at that time. The wounds from that period have not yet healed on the earth. China and Japan are all on the same page but not satisfied. As for the U.S., if there is a conflict between Vietnam and China, the U.S. will definitely provide weapons aid to Vietnam because currently, China is the main competitor that America needs to eliminate in the international arena. Once China becomes mired in the battlefield of Vietnam, China will decline in all aspects. At that time, America can preserve its leading position in the world that China is trying to gain. If Vietnam wins, the U.S. will have the opportunity to operate easily in the East Sea without being blocked by China. The U.S. will prioritize providing weapons aid to Vietnam. Supporting Vietnam seems to be supporting Ukraine versus Russia, and if China and Vietnam have a conflict, the one who will benefit the most is the U.S. However, all of the above aid hypotheses are only material and economic weapons, but if anyone wants human aid, we will certainly not accept it in Vietnam, because Vietnam always wants to be self-reliant and does not want to depend too much on other countries' influence. Towards a stable political situation, Vietnam is always self-reliant and always correctly assesses one thing, that national sovereignty and interests are sacred and supreme and cannot be completely entrusted to outsiders. Being strong in defending the Vietnamese fatherland is the internal strength of the entire nation combined with the strength of the times. The strength of independence, self-reliance, and self-reliance. So coming to Vietnam to defend the fatherland must be with intellectual courage. The country's true wisdom, strength, and endogenous strength, the combination of national strength and the strength of the times, cannot rely on any military alliance, and cannot rely on foreign countries in both theory and practice, including history. Reality clearly shows that if a country wants to maintain its independence and sovereignty, it must rely on its own resources and absolutely must not depend on other countries' external forces to maintain its independence. Establishing the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country is the highest and immutable principle, not only in Vietnam but also in most countries in the world. For example, Afghanistan has spent more than 20 years under U.S. sponsorship, but just over 10 days before the attack of the Taliban force, this country completely collapsed. So relying on one's own strength is always the important and decisive internal strength in protecting the fatherland. Patriotism, self-respect, and national unity, regardless of the fate of the opponent. Vietnam will win, and this has been proven through many of Vietnam's bitter wars, from the founding of the country until now. What do you think about this issue? Please leave a comment below. Remember to subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends. Visit the channel every day. Thank you for watching. Bye and have a nice day.